On a quiet Monday afternoon in late November 2021, a driver arrived at an elegant gated community in the hills outside Bogotá with a growing sense of unease. He worked for Mauricio Leal, one of Colombia's most beloved celebrity hairstylists, and Mauricio hadn't shown up at his salon that day, highly unusual for the hard-working stylist known as El Niño Genio, the boy genius of beauty. Clients were waiting, calls and messages had gone unanswered. Concerned, the driver and Mauricio's older brother, Mauricio Leal, headed to Mauricio's residence in La Calera, a lush area in the mountains where many wealthy families lived. When they reached the modern white mansion, all the doors were locked. The house was still and quiet. Peering through a window, they saw a chilling sight, the silhouette of a person lying on Mauricio's bed. Desperate, the driver found an open window, climbed inside, and unlocked the door for Jonier. Together, they stepped into a nightmare. In the master bedroom, 47-year-old Mauricio Leal was sprawled lifeless on the bed, and beside him lay the body of his mother, 67-year-old Marlene Hernandez. It looked as though mother and son had both been stabbed to death. A blood-stained knife was on the bed, and unsettlingly, a piece of its blade was still embedded in Mauricio's abdomen. On a nightstand, there was a handwritten note, apparently penned by Mauricio. In a shaky scrawl, it read, "I love you, forgive me, I can't go on. I leave everything to my siblings and cousins. All my love, forgive me, mother." The implication was horrifying. It suggested that Mauricio had murdered his own mother and then taken his own life in a moment of despair. To the first officers on the scene, the tragedy initially appeared to be a murder-suicide, a family pact gone terribly wrong. The news of the famous stylist's death spread quickly and plunged the Colombian public into shock. Mauricio Leal wasn't just any hairstylist. He was the hairstylist to the stars. He had risen from humble beginnings in Cali, starting out sweeping floors in salons, to eventually owning a high-end salon in Bogotá, frequented by beauty queens, telenovela actresses, pop singers, and TV presenters. Friendly and soft-spoken, Mauricio was known for treating clients like family. He made regular appearances on TV-style segments, always smiling and impeccably dressed, his own hair often dyed platinum blonde. By 2021, he had achieved national fame and was about to embark on international projects. He'd even been invited to collaborate on Miss Universe and a Victoria's Secret event. For someone so successful and seemingly happy to be found dead under such tragic circumstances, fans and friends were baffled. Why would Mauricio kill his beloved mother Marlene and then himself? It made no sense, one of his longtime clients said on a news broadcast, echoing what many were thinking. In the days following the discovery, tearful tributes poured in from Colombian celebrities. They spoke of Mauricio's generosity and positive spirit. He had just been planning a big birthday celebration for himself. He would have turned 48 on November 24th, 2021, just 2 days after his body was found. Nothing in his recent behavior hinted at suicidal depression or violence. If anything, Mauricio seemed optimistic about the future. As investigators from the Technical Investigation Corps of the Attorney General's office began examining the gruesome scene inside the La Calera home, a few details immediately raised red flags. "We have a double homicide until proven otherwise," one detective quietly remarked to a colleague, unconvinced by the murder-suicide note. For one thing, the manner of death was highly unusual for a suicide. Mauricio had multiple stab wounds, including a deep knife wound to his abdomen. Almost like a bizarre attempt at seppuku, the Japanese ritual suicide, which is virtually unheard of in Colombia. It seemed implausible that a man would stab himself to death in such a manner, especially after supposedly stabbing his own mother first. The position of the bodies also felt too neat. Marlene's body was lying peacefully beside her son's, as if placed there deliberately. There was surprisingly little blood on the bed under Marlene, even though she had been stabbed, which was strange. Meanwhile, Mauricio's side of the bed was soaked with blood, far more than his mother's. This inconsistency hinted that Marlene might not have been killed on that spot at all. And then there was the knife, or rather, knives. Investigators recovered not one, but two bloodied kitchen knives from the room. The first knife's blade had broken off inside Mauricio's body, and its handle was found hidden under a pillow, intentionally tucked out of sight. The second knife was found on the bed as well. If Mauricio had truly been the assailant and then committed suicide, why would there be two knives? Would he have stabbed himself so forcefully that the blade broke, then calmly gone to get another knife to finish the job? That scenario made little sense. An experienced prosecutor on the scene flatly stated, "It's impossible that Mauricio, with a knife blade stuck in him, went down to the kitchen to grab another knife." The evidence was contradicting the simplistic murder-suicide theory. Police sealed off the house as a crime scene, and forensic teams scoured each room for clues. Over the next hours and days, more evidence emerged that this was no open and shut suicide case. The autopsies provided a clearer timeline. The medical examiner concluded that both Mauricio and Marlene had been dead for approximately 30 to 36 hours by the time they were discovered on the afternoon of November 22nd, 2021. That placed their time of death somewhere in the early hours of November 21st, well before the time Mauricio Leal said he last saw them alive. In his initial statement, Mauricio had told police that he'd had breakfast with his mother and brother on the 21st and then left them doing fine. If the autopsy was correct, that was a lie. By breakfast time on the 21st, they had likely already been dead. The autopsy on Mauricio also found traces of a powerful sedative in his system, Zopiclone, a prescription sleeping pill. It appeared Mauricio had been drugged before his death, which could explain why there were no signs of struggle and why he might have been physically unable to defend himself or escape. Zopiclone would have made him extremely drowsy, perhaps even unconscious, at the time he was attacked. That finding was critical. If Mauricio had been heavily sedated, he could not have possibly murdered his mother and then energetically stabbed himself multiple times. Instead, it suggested he was the victim of a calculated plan. Investigators now theorized that the killer had slipped Mauricio a dose of sleeping medication to render him defenseless, en estado de indefensión, as the report later put it, then staged the scene to pin the blame on him. The handwritten note found by the bed was another piece of the puzzle. Handwriting experts would later confirm that the note was indeed written by Mauricio, but likely under duress. The phrasing and scrawl suggested he was terrified and not writing of his own free will. Everything pointed to an elaborate cover-up. Suspicion quickly began to center on the only other person known to have been in the house around that time, Mauricio Rodolfo Leal Hernandez, Mauricio's 49-year-old brother. Mauricio lived with Mauricio and their mother in the same house. In fact, his bedroom was just down the hall from Mauricio's. From the outset, Mauricio was both a witness and a potential suspect, simply by virtue of proximity. Statistically, police know that when a family is murdered, a relative in the home is often involved. But in those first days, no one wanted to believe that possibility. By all appearances, Mauricio was the grieving brother. He attended the joint funeral of Mauricio and Marlene, sobbing inconsolably in front of TV cameras. In an exclusive interview with El Tiempo newspaper just days after the bodies were found, Mauricio spoke in a voice trembling with emotion. "We're still in shock. We're destroyed. We're waiting for the authorities to tell us what happened. My brother was an angel," he said, praising Mauricio's legacy and promising to keep his salon business running. To the public, Mauricio presented himself as a heartbroken man who had lost his beloved younger brother and mother at the same time. But behind the scenes, investigators noted unsettling behavior from Mauricio. One detective described Mauricio's demeanor in those initial interviews as oddly detached, a lack of emotional connection to the deaths, as the detective put it. While other relatives were hysterical with grief, Mauricio seemed preoccupied and jittery. He changed details in his story, and certain things he said didn't line up with the evidence. For instance, he insisted that when he and the driver arrived on the 22nd, he had not climbed in through any window. The insinuation bothered him greatly and he was eager to correct the record on that point. It struck investigators as peculiar that he cared so much about denying that minor detail to the press. Why was he so defensive about how they entered the house? Perhaps, the police thought, because Jonier knew any hint that he'd entered earlier, say to commit the murders, could look bad for him. It wasn't just the forensic evidence that pointed toward Jonier. The circumstantial evidence of motive was growing too. As the investigation dug into the Leal family's background, a stark contrast between the two brothers emerged. Mauricio had been the family's shining star, successful, generous, and the primary breadwinner supporting his mother. Jonier, 1 year older, had led a much more troubled life. He was a hairdresser as well, always in Mauricio's shadow. In fact, it was Mauricio who had brought Jonier to Bogotá and given him a job at the salon, trying to help his brother find steady footing. But unlike Mauricio's booming business, Jonier's own ventures had all failed. He struggled financially, had debts, and reportedly even had a history of gambling and personal problems, though those details were mostly whispered among those who knew the family. Meanwhile, Mauricio, who was single with no children, had amassed a considerable fortune by Colombian standards. A beautiful house, a luxury SUV, high-end salon equipment, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in his bank accounts. In the wake of the deaths, attention turned to what would happen with Mauricio's estate. Because he died without a spouse or kids, his nearest heirs were his siblings, and wouldn't you know it, the supposed suicide note explicitly said, "I leave everything to my siblings and cousins." To investigators, that line in the note practically screamed motive. The main person standing to benefit from Mauricio and Marlene's deaths was Jonier. On January 14th, 2022, almost 8 weeks after the murders, the Colombian Attorney General's office made its move. Jonier Leal was arrested and formally charged with the aggravated homicides of his mother and brother. When the tactical unit officers showed up to arrest him at dawn, Jonier appeared strangely unsurprised. In fact, as they searched his home, they found something rather telling. Jonier had in his possession bank account numbers, property titles, and other documents belonging to Mauricio, which he had set aside as if preparing to inherit everything. It seemed he was already calculating how to take over his late brother's fortune. The authorities knew they had the right man, but they also knew this would be a complex case to prosecute. It relied heavily on forensic evidence and would be fought in the courts, likely with fierce resistance from Jonier. At Jonier's first court appearance in Bogotá, prosecutor Mario Burgos presented a chilling reconstruction of the crime. Over the course of hours of testimony, Burgos laid out the prosecution's theory detail by detail, calling it an act of pure greed and cruelty. According to the evidence, on the night of November 21st, 2021, Jonier put into motion a plan he had likely contemplated for weeks. That Sunday, security camera footage from the exclusive Arboreto residential complex showed the comings and goings of the Leal family. Mauricio, Marlene, and Jonier were home together through most of the weekend. Around 6:13 p.m. on Sunday, Jonier left to attend a family gathering elsewhere, giving him an alibi for the early part of the evening. While at that gathering, he even received an innocent voice message from Mauricio, asking him to pick up some cookies on the way home. Nothing seemed amiss. At 11:37 p.m., cameras captured Jonier re-entering the gated community and returning to house number 18, the Leal home. Prosecutor Burgos asserted that sometime between roughly midnight and the early morning hours of November 22nd, Jonier carried out the meticulously staged double murder. The sequence of events, as presented by the prosecution and forensic findings, was as follows. First, Jonier likely slipped a dose of sedative into Mauricio's food or drink on Sunday night, ensuring his brother would be in a deep sleep. Marlene, the mother, had her own bedroom on the 3rd floor of the house. Jonier entered her room first, perhaps while she slept, and attacked the 67-year-old woman with a kitchen knife. Marlene had virtually no chance. She was smaller and older, and if she was asleep, she was taken completely by surprise. The evidence indicated Marlene was stabbed multiple times and died in her bed on the 3rd floor. Her injuries were severe and immediately fatal. Next, Jonier moved to the 2nd floor where Mauricio's master bedroom was. Drugged with zopiclone, Mauricio was likely groggy and confused, but he woke to a nightmare, his own brother looming over him with a knife. Investigators believe Jonier began attacking Mauricio with the same knife, delivering at least 4 serious stab wounds. Mauricio, though a healthy adult man, was incapacitated by the drug and the shock of the assault. He suffered puncture wounds to his torso, arms, and even his nose, injuries that suggested a violent struggle and an attempt by the killer to subdue him into compliance. The forensic team later noted that Mauricio was right-handed, yet the angle and direction of many wounds indicated they were inflicted by a left-handed attacker. This was significant because Jonier, according to people who knew him, was left-handed, a subtle but incriminating detail. At some point during this attack, the blade of the knife actually broke off inside Mauricio's body, lodging into his internal organs. Mauricio was gravely wounded, but possibly still alive at that moment. Jonier needed another knife to finish what he started, so he left the room, leaving the broken blade impaled in his brother, and hurried to the kitchen to grab a second knife. He returned and continued his horrific task. Under threat and in agony, Mauricio was forced to do something unimaginable: write his own suicide notes. Investigators found not 1 but 2 handwritten letters at the scene. It appears the first may have been a draft and the second the final copy. In these notes, essentially the same message repeated, Mauricio purportedly confessed to murdering his mother and begged forgiveness. Prosecutor Burgos later explained that Jonier held Mauricio at knife point, coercing him to pen those words as a way to divert suspicion. Handwriting analysis and other evidence showed Mauricio's writing was shaky and inconsistent by that time, likely due to blood loss and the sedatives. He was in a state of helplessness as he complied with his brother's demands. Once the notes were written and signed, Jonier delivered the final blows to Mauricio, ending his life. Now came the staging. Jonier retrieved their mother's lifeless body from the 3rd-floor bedroom and carried or dragged her down to the 2nd-floor master bedroom. In doing so, he left a small but damning trail, a smear of Marlene's blood on the staircase, and another drop on a towel later found in Jonier's bathroom. He placed Marlene's body neatly on the bed next to Mauricio's, perhaps even tucking her in somewhat. He positioned the suicide note prominently where police couldn't miss it. He scattered a few pill containers around, maybe to hint that Mauricio had taken something, or to explain the presence of the sedative in his system. He also made a crucial mistake here. The bed where he laid Marlene had clean sheets on her side, with no blood, inconsistent with someone who had been stabbed to death there. This later suggested that Jonier had changed the bedding to hide blood from her actual death upstairs, an overly meticulous touch that investigators noticed. After arranging the bodies, Jonier set about destroying evidence of his involvement. He tried to wipe away bloodstains and other traces. In the bathroom that Jonier used, investigators later discovered a drain, siphon, with traces of blood, as if someone had been washing off gore. They also found a mop, trapero, with bloodstains abandoned out on Jonier's balcony, which was very unusual. The family's maid testified that mop was normally kept in a downstairs closet, yet now it was found near Jonier's rooms, indicating it had been used and left there during cleanup. Cleaning liquids and bleach were found in odd places too, basically confirming that someone had tried to scrub the crime scene clean. In fact, the forensic team noted the smell of disinfectant still lingering. During the later trial, the prosecutor summed it up. Jonier cleaned up with a mop and cleaning fluids. In his rush to construct his lie, he removed a corpse, changed sheets, and attempted to leave a perfect scene. One of the most eerie pieces of evidence came from Mauricio's own iPhone. Investigators discovered audio voice notes recorded on the phone, seemingly messages from Mauricio to his family, in which he confessed to killing his mother and said he was going to end his life. At first glance, these recordings sounded like a man overcome with guilt, except for the timing. The timestamps on the audio files showed they were created after Mauricio was already dead. More sophisticated analysis revealed that the voice in those recordings wasn't actually Mauricio's at all. It was Jonier impersonating his brother, or perhaps speaking under his breath, trying to fabricate yet more proof of the staged scenario. It appears that during the frenzy of covering up, Johnny Eyre grabbed Mauricio's phone and recorded these voice notes, intending for authorities to find them and conclude Mauricio had confessed. If this sounds like overkill, it was, but it illustrates how far Johnny Eyre went to try to fool everyone. In fact, a video clip eventually surfaced that is almost too disturbing to believe. A short video of Mauricio's final moments, recorded on that phone's camera. In the video, a weak and pale Mauricio is seen propped up in bed next to his mother's inert body. He addresses the camera haltingly, saying, "Forgive me. I can't anymore. Nobody knows what anyone's going through," seemingly taking the blame. A whispered voice off camera prompts him. You can hear someone say, "Las sábanas," the sheets, quietly, as if giving instructions. Mauricio then pulls down the blanket covering him to reveal his t-shirt, soaked in blood around his stomach. "I just stuck the knives in myself, and my mum too," he says weakly on the video. In his final breathless line, Mauricio looks upward, as if at the person holding the camera, and asks plaintively, "Now what do I do? What do I do?" The video then cuts off. It's a harrowing visual record of the coercion and staged nature of the crime. This video was not actually released to the public until years later, in 2024, causing national outrage when people saw the extent of manipulation Mauricio endured. But authorities have indicated they were aware of its contents during the investigation. The existence of the video and the audio notes underscores just how calculating Johnny Eyre was in trying to frame his dead brother. After completing the staging and cleanup in the morning of November 22nd, Johnny Eyre stepped back to survey the scene. He had placed the second knife, the one he fetched from the kitchen, in Mauricio's lifeless hand or nearby, to make it look self-inflicted. The first knife's blade remained in Mauricio's abdomen, but its handle was hidden under a pillow, perhaps an oversight in the heat of the moment. With everything arranged, Johnny Eyre left the house. Security cameras captured him driving away from the compound at around 11:15 a.m. on the 22nd. Presumably, he went somewhere to dispose of any remaining evidence, maybe the missing bedsheets or bloody clothes, or simply to establish an alibi that he was out while the tragedy was discovered. Not long after, he returned with the driver under the pretense of worrying about Mauricio's no-show at work, leading to the dramatic discovery that afternoon. The case against Johnny Eyre was overwhelming. By mid-January 2022, prosecutors publicly detailed all these findings in a preliminary charging hearing. The charges were aggravated homicide, with multiple aggravating factors, kinship, using a victim's defenseless state and acting with cruelty, and obstruction of justice for the attempted cover-up. In that January 17th, 2022 hearing, as the evidence was laid out, witnesses say Johnny Eyre sat in the courtroom, initially looking distracted, even bored. At one point, the judge had to snap at him to pay attention. Only when the prosecutor spelled out the potential sentence he faced did Johnny Eyre become visibly nervous. The judge asked the prosecutor to clarify how many years in prison Johnny Eyre was looking at if convicted. The answer came, approximately 43 years behind bars, possibly more. However, if Johnny Eyre were to accept responsibility and plead guilty at that stage, Colombian law would allow a significant reduction, up to a 50% reduction of the sentence. In other words, a plea deal could make his sentence around 20 to 27 years, instead of 43 to 50 years. When the court took a short recess, Johnny Eyre huddled with his attorney to weigh his options. The evidence against him was ironclad. If he went to trial and lost, he'd likely spend the rest of his life in prison. A few minutes later, as the hearing resumed on January 18, 2022, Johnny Leal made a surprise turnabout. He stood before the judge and the assembled press and confessed. "I have taken the decision, freely and voluntarily, to accept the charges through an agreement with the Fiscalia," he said. In a tremulous voice he continued, "I want to express my repentance, asking forgiveness, first of all, from my family and my children, the victims and all of Colombia for what happened." This statement was broadcast live and stunned those watching. Many Colombians had been following the case and still wondered if perhaps Mauricio had really done it. Now here was Johnny Eyre, the brother, dramatically admitting he was the killer. In his speech, he mentioned he had consulted with his lawyer and decided to take a very personal decision to accept responsibility. He even specifically asked forgiveness from his 2 young children, an emotional touch that some felt was calculated to garner sympathy. This confession was a major twist in the saga. It appeared that justice would be swift. With his admission of guilt, all that remained was formal sentencing. Under the plea agreement reported at the time, Jonier was supposed to receive a sentence of around 27 years in prison in exchange for accepting the charges. For many, 27 years felt far too lenient for the brutal killing of 2 family members, but it was within the bounds of Colombian law due to his confession. However, the case was about to take another unexpected turn. Just 3 months later, in April 2022, Jonier astonished everyone by retracting his confession. In an April 22nd hearing before a different judge, Jonier's new attorney, a high-profile defense lawyer named Ana Juliet Velasquez, declared that Jonier wished to renounce the pre-agreement and plead not guilty. Velasquez explained that she was Jonier's attorney of choice, but had not been present in January. Back then, Jonier had a public defender. Now that she was representing him, she advised that his rights had been violated. According to her, Jonier claimed he had been coerced into confessing by pressure from the prosecution. He allegedly believed he was going to get only 18 years if he confessed, but the written deal turned out to be 27 years. Feeling tricked, Jonier decided to back out. In court, his lawyer dramatically stated, "My client will not ask forgiveness for something he didn't do, and for a plea deal to which he was coerced." She insisted that Jonier was innocent and had only admitted guilt under duress. The judge questioned Jonier directly. Was he now denying his earlier confession and rejecting the plea deal? Jonier replied firmly, "Definitely, I do not accept the charges. I accept nothing. I am innocent." And with that, the case was thrown back into a full trial posture. Jonier's attempt to withdraw his plea meant prosecutors had to prepare to prove his guilt all over again in a courtroom, despite the January confession being on record. Colombian legal procedure allows a defendant to retract a plea deal before final sentencing, and that's exactly what Jonier did. Many observers were stunned. He was really going to fight this, despite the mountain of evidence. Some speculated that Jonier was playing a long game. By dragging out the trial, maybe he hoped for some evidence to be deemed inadmissible, or for a procedural mistake that could benefit him. Or perhaps, given the high-profile nature of the case, he simply couldn't accept being labelled a murderer so publicly and wanted to salvage his name, however futile it seemed. And so began a long, drawn-out judicial process. Over the next 2 years, the Mauricio Leal murder case wound its way through the Colombian justice system, with numerous hearings, appeals, and delays. Jonier's defense team employed every strategy available to challenge the prosecution's case. They filed motions claiming Jonier's rights had been violated, arguing evidence was mishandled, and even lodged a tuteleur, a special constitutional appeal, asserting that Jonier wasn't receiving a fair trial. At one point, Jonier himself complained to the trial judge that he did not have the necessary guarantees to mount his defense and that his rights were being infringed. These claims, however, did not find much traction. Despite the defense's efforts, the core evidence remained unshakable. The forensic findings, the blood traces, the fingerprints, the CCTV footage, the handwriting analysis, the audio recordings, all pointed squarely to Jonier. The prosecutors presented expert after expert, who systematically dismantled the notion of a murder-suicide and tied the crimes to Jonier. For example, DNA analysis showed that a strand of hair found clutched on Marlene's body matched Jonier, suggesting a struggle or physical contact during her killing. Blood from Marlene was found on a towel in Jonier's bathroom, and a drop on the staircase matched her blood as well. The broken knife handle under the pillow had Jonier's fingerprints. It was also revealed that in the days following the murders, before his arrest, Jonier had made some suspicious financial moves. He attempted to withdraw large sums from Mauricio's business accounts and contacted a lawyer about claiming his brother's assets, which looked very incriminating when brought up in court. Throughout the trial, the prosecution maintained a clear motive: money. In closing arguments, a state attorney bluntly declared, The murderer is Jonier Leal Hernandez, and accused him of killing for the fortune of the stylist to the famous. Indeed, Mauricio's sizable estate was effectively frozen after his death, pending investigation. In a parallel civil process, the government's Financial Crimes Unit was pursuing the seizure of Mauricio's assets, partly because some of his money was suspected to be tied to money laundering for drug traffickers, an unrelated twist that nonetheless meant Jonier might never get that fortune, even if he had gotten away with murder. So, not only had Jonier destroyed his family, but the very prize he sought was slipping away. One poignant moment during the trial came from the testimony of a family friend, Karen Ruiz, who had helped organize what was supposed to be Mauricio's birthday party just days after he died. She revealed a telling detail. Marlene, the mother, had explicitly told her that she did not want Jonier invited to Mauricio's birthday celebration. Karen testified that when she was going over the guest list with Marlene, suggesting they include Jonier since he was Mauricio's brother, Marlene replied emphatically, "No, not at all, under no circumstances," using a tone that shocked Karen. This suggested that Marlene and Mauricio might have been growing wary of Jonier in the weeks leading up to the crime. Perhaps Marlene had sensed something was off with her eldest son, maybe a brewing resentment or erratic behavior, and she didn't even want him at a family party. This bit of testimony added a heartbreaking layer to the family dynamic. Marlene seemingly feared discord or trouble if Jonier was around, but no one imagined he would go to such lengths. It also undercut any notion by the defense that relations were peachy or that Jonier was the dutiful son. In fact, much of the testimony painted Jonier as increasingly bitter and jealous. Witnesses described how Mauricio's success ate at Jonier. One salon employee recounted how Jonier would make snide remarks like, "Must be nice to be the favorite," when Mauricio got praise. Another witness said Jonier had asked, half-jokingly, how much one could get by selling a luxury salon chair, hints that he was eyeing the business valuables. All of this helped the prosecution narrate a story of a man consumed by envy and greed. After 2 years of legal battling, justice caught up with Jonier Leal. In late 2023, the trial finally concluded. On February 27, 2024, a judge in Bogotá delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge found that the Fiscalía, prosecutor's office, had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that Jonier had murdered his mother and brother with cruelty, sevicia, while they were in a defenseless state, and had staged the scene to mislead investigators. Hearing the verdict, Jonier showed little emotion at first, but when it came time to discuss the upcoming sentence, he finally spoke up. He addressed the court, still insisting on his innocence despite the guilty verdict. "Señora Juez, I obviously do not agree with the verdict. I will always proclaim my innocence," Jonier said defiantly. He went on to say that what the prosecution sought, effectively a life term, was akin to a death sentence for him. "At my age, a sentence like that is practically a death sentence. It means never leaving prison," he remarked to the judge, perhaps in a last-ditch plea for leniency. Indeed, at 50 years old, any sentence approaching half a century would ensure he dies behind bars. But the judge and the public had little sympathy left for Jonier. A few months later, on June 14, 2024, Jonier Leal's sentence was announced. He received 55 years and 3 months in prison, one of the harshest penalties in recent Colombian history for a case of this kind. The judge in charge heeded the prosecution's request for the maximum penalty. Additionally, Jonier was fined the equivalent of about $1 million for the damage caused and for the crime of tampering with evidence. In Colombian legal context, 55 years is an extraordinarily long sentence. Jonier was sent to La Picota prison in Bogotá, a facility known for housing some of Colombia's high-profile criminals. In media interviews, an aunt of Mauricio's tearfully called Jonier a monster, lamenting that greed had destroyed their family. It's worth noting that by backing out of the plea deal, Jonier not only doubled his prison time, but also forfeited any goodwill. The judge specifically cited his lack of remorse and the egregious betrayal of family trust as reasons for the stiff sentence. As one prosecutor put it, he had a chance to seek forgiveness and leniency, and he threw it away. Now he faces the full weight of justice. In interviews, several of Mauricio's famous clients shared their memories of him. His warmth, his talent, the way he'd say, "Gorgeous, you look gorgeous," after finishing a hairstyle, making everyone feel like a star. That is how they choose to remember him, not the grim images from that crime scene or the macabre video that leaked, but the generous soul and creative genius he was in life.